Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Matthew Continetti, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon. I'm also a faculty member at the Hertog Foundation. And I'm pleased to be here this evening to moderate a conversation on America's cities and the urban crisis with Reihan Salam, my friend of close to 20 years. Reihan is the Manhattan Institute's fifth president. He is a contributing editor at The Atlantic, National Affairs, as well as National Review, where he was the magazine's executive editor prior to joining the Manhattan Institute. He's also the author of Melting Pot, or Civil War, a book about immigration, which I recommend heartily, and the co-author with New York Times columnist Ross Douthat of Grand New Party, which appeared in 2008. So for the first half of this conversation, I'll ask a few questions to Reihan myself, and then we'll hear from three political studies fellows who have submitted questions in advance. And then if there's time, as I hope there will be time, you never know, we'll take questions from the wider audience. And you can submit your questions via Zoom's Q&A function if you can figure out where that is. I'm kind of a technological nincompoop, so I don't know where that is. But you will find it out and submit your questions. If your question is selected, you'll be recognized, and then you will ask your question, and you're welcome to begin submitting any questions you might have to Reihan right now. So Reihan, again, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you, even if
it's
virtually.
Good to see you too.
I thought I might begin by asking you, you're a native New Yorker, grew up in Brooklyn, and now you're the president of really the premier think tank in New York. And I wanted to ask you how the New York City of today, 2020, compares to the New York in which you kind of came of age in the 1990s.
One obvious difference is that the New York City of 1990 was a far more violent place. In 1990, there were 2,245 murders in the five boroughs. And in 2019, there were 319. Now, comparing that era to the very present moment is a bit complicated because the COVID crisis has really scrambled things in complicated ways. It remains to be seen how many of those changes are durable, but it is true that we've seen a bit of a spike in homicides and in other crime in recent months, which one hopes is merely a blip, could be part of a larger trend. But even then, even when you take into account that recent increase, overall, the city is far less violent. And homicides are just the tip of the iceberg. You see that when it comes to robberies, when it comes to all manner of crime that really affected the tenor of life in the city in that era. And it also affected economic life. That threat of violence that was always looming is something that limited investment. It led people to leave the city as soon as they could. And as you saw that crime decline, which was particularly pronounced in New York City, the criminologist Franklin Zimring puts it this way. If you look at the country as a whole, you saw one decade-long crime decline, roughly from the early 1990s to the early 2000s. But then in New York City in particular, you saw another steep decade-long crime decline that was almost as pronounced as that first one, to the point where you started seeing crime levels that were comparable to what you were seeing in the 1950s. So a really dramatic change that had a very, very big effect on the city, made it a more amenity-rich city, made it more of a magnet for skilled professionals from around the country and around the world. And that fed into another very big change between the New York City of my upbringing and the New York City of today, which is that the kind of demographic composition of the city became markedly different. That's something that I would love to discuss further. But in big picture terms, in 1990, the city had about 2 million foreign-born individuals. If you're looking at the most recent census data, it's more like 3.2 million. That's one big change. If you're looking at the population, basically the non-Hispanic white population and the Black population have declined as a share of the city overall, and the Hispanic population and the Asian population have increased considerably. Now, you don't necessarily see that reflected in the political life of the city, something that we can discuss at greater length, partly because when you're looking at those populations, you have a large number of folks who are non-citizens, whether because they're unauthorized or because they are lawful permanent residents who've chosen not to naturalize, which has a kind of complicated effect on the political life of the city. Because when you look at the city's new working class, a lot of that working class is not actually incorporated into the city's political and civic life, and that's a pretty big change. Another change is that when you're looking at that non-Hispanic white population, a term that I've never cared for, so that population is smaller now than it was in 1990, but it's not that much smaller as a share of the whole than it was in 2010 or 2000, but the composition of that population is very, very different. When I was growing up, New York City was still very much a city of white ethnics. You still had a good-sized population of native-born Americans who were working class, lower middle class, who were really the backbone of many outer borough neighborhoods. And throughout my upbringing, that changed really markedly, because though the city's population, grew somewhat over time, although actually it's declined over the last 3 years, but it grew over that larger period. What you saw is a very large outflow of native-born Americans, particularly white and black native-born Americans, and a big inflow of foreign-born folks, an inflow that's actually slowed down quite a bit recently. So that's another thing that's really changed the texture of life in the city. There's much else to say about the strengthening of some civic institutions. You see our great universities, for example, you see our great parks, many other institutions have been buoyed by the incredible concentration of skilled professionals and the concomitant concentration of wealth in the city. But at the same time, you've seen a kind of erosion in the civic identity of the city, in which you have many professionals who are attracted by the city's amenities, but who are not necessarily invested in the city in the same way, through no fault of theirs, partly because the political climate is much more hostile. If you think about the 1970s, that last moment when the city faced a really dire fiscal crisis, what you saw was leaders in financial services, leaders in business really work hand in hand with city and state government to rescue the city. Now, however, you're seeing much more hostility towards employers, towards the business sector. At the same time, you're seeing a business sector where high-end employers, they simply employ fewer people. They are much more footloose. They're much more mobile than they had been in earlier eras. Even when you're looking at the 80s, you still had something of a garment manufacturing sector in the city. You still had some of that residue of the kind of great industrial city you had in earlier eras. But now that's pretty much entirely gone. And when you're looking at the kind of working class and lower middle class of the city, they're overwhelmingly concentrated in in-person service jobs. Jobs that, as we can discuss further, have been a huge source of job growth, not necessarily of wage growth, a huge source of stability, and something that has really become complicated over the last few months.
So I think it's impossible to talk about the city today without recognizing, as you mentioned, the coronavirus and all of the kind of attendant consequences of that, whether that has to do with the fiscal crisis facing the city itself, the fiscal crisis facing the MTA, the social consequences of coronavirus, which I think play some role in the civil unrest that America's cities have been experiencing this summer. So from your position, as you look at the urban landscape today, what do you think are the most pressing issues facing America's cities?
Well, right now, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, but there are some underlying trends that might be accelerated by COVID that are very much of interest. One, which I alluded to a moment ago, is that you already saw some population pressures. A big one is that for New York City and many other major cities, net international migration has been the source of all net population growth. And over the last year and a half, what you've seen is a steep decline in net international migration. Part of that can be attributed to policy changes, particularly in the most recent months. But actually, you see another bigger dynamic, which is that when you're looking at the countries that have been the traditional source countries of immigrants to the United States, these are places that are experiencing rapid aging. If you're looking at Mexico, for example, Mexico is actually aging more rapidly than the United States. If you're looking at East Asia, you're seeing very rapid aging there that is similarly much more pronounced than what you're seeing in the United States. So these countries that we think of as a kind of bottomless source of potential migrants are simply not that in the same way. You're moving to a world where it's much more that you're competing for working age migrants than that you're trying to resist some larger tide. Now that's masked to some degree by the fact that you really do have a surge or you did have a surge, I should say, in migration from Central America, a region that, has experienced a youth bulge. They experienced a youth bulge about 10, 20 years later than Mexico did. And that's part of what's a big push factor from those regions, and also sub-Saharan Africa. But those, sub-Saharan Africa, which is a very big part of the story, but that of course is going to affect Europe in a much more direct way than the United States, at least for the foreseeable future. So that is a big thing that the COVID crisis has potentially sharpened, partly because you're seeing some outflows. Here, it's very hard to get reliable data because, again, you're capturing a snapshot. But in New York City, you've seen a number of analyses suggesting that somewhere between 400 and 500,000 residents left the city in the immediate wake of the COVID crisis. Now, again, that can be a little misleading because some of these people are students, some of them are affluent people who typically leave during summer months, but it does seem as though that departure has been more pronounced. And then the issue is, does that wind up proving durable? So the people I'm talking about are, yes, some of them are students, but also high income households and people who've been able to transition more or less seamlessly to knowledge work. Now, one reason this matters is because in many US cities, particularly in more left of center parts of the country, these are places that have moved towards more progressive taxation at the state and even at the local level, which is to say that these are places where the tax base is very dependent on a relatively small number of households and a small number of relatively mobile households. Now, the consensus opinion among social scientists had been that this is not necessarily a super footloose, super mobile population, partly because the highest earners, most of them are people who have a windfall year. They're not necessarily people who are earning very high incomes in every year. And when you're experiencing one windfall year, it could be that your social network matters more. You're embedded in a particular place and your earning potential is tied to that particular place. So, you could say, hey, I want to move to a lower tax jurisdiction, but then again, your earning opportunities might diminish. The difference now is that you've actually had this calamity that has forced people to move to other places, and it has forced them to see whether or not their networks are in fact portable, whether their skills are portable, whether or not people are willing to operate in this remote environment on an ongoing basis. So you could say that the inertia before was in favor of remaining in place. And let's say when you're a retiree, when you have some event where you might realize a capital gain, that might be something that pushes you over the fence. But even then, it's also a matter of how many days you're located in one place or another. But when you're relocating for a period of several months, when you're someone who is a working age professional who has children in school, and when those arrangements are disrupted, that starts to really change how people are thinking. And given that these jurisdictions are oftentimes really focused on a very, very small slice of the population, even pretty modest defections, even modest departures can be very meaningful for the tax base. And it's one reason why you've seen some ostensibly aggressively egalitarian or progressive politicians, including the mayor of New York City, actually expressing some alarm about this potential exodus of high-income professionals. So that's something that is very much worth bearing in mind. And another big issue is the nationalization of US politics, which is something we can talk about more, but basically the fact that people vote at the local level the way they vote at the national level, even when the particular issues at the local or the state level are quite different. This is less true for governors and mayors than it is for legislators, city council members, but it is very pronounced for people at that level of government, and it's a big problem. So there are many other things that come to mind, including just the public health challenges in particular. Happy to talk about all of that at greater length, but hopefully that'll give you something to work with.
Sure, of course. I wanted to ask you too, in this moment of kind of flux and turbulence, my work tends to deal with the past and history. And I've recently been writing about that moment in the 1990s when there were several reform-minded Republican mayors, Richard Riordan in Los Angeles, Stephen Goldsmith in Indianapolis, and of course, Rudy Giuliani of the 1990s, who kind of had this, they were all Republicans, and they kind of had a very, they were socially liberals, but they had a conservatism that was based on kind of personal security, economic growth, and then a focus on civil society. What happened to them? Where are they? Are there people at authorities at the local level who are still working in that mold, and do they have any heirs, and how can we try to recapture that moment?
The best way to think about this, I think, is through the lens of the nationalization of American politics. When you're looking at some of those figures, they were very unique because they were operating in a really different partisan environment where they were able to exploit some of those differences between how partisan politics manifested themselves at the national level versus the local level. If you think about Rudy Giuliani, for example, when he first was planning to run for mayor in 1989, when he was narrowly defeated, he was actually planning to run to the left of then New York City Mayor Ed Koch. And when Ed Koch surprisingly was defeated in the Democratic primary, he pivoted in a very different direction to more of a law and order orientation, and something that wound up proving quite successful to the surprise of many observers. But it's kind of funny to think about that Giuliani in that era, in the kind of mid-late 80s, was someone who was very much positioning himself more as a John Lindsay figure. To those of you who don't know, John Lindsay was a New York City mayor who was a very emphatic liberal, and someone who was a champion of the liberal persuasion among Republicans, which was, a very strong tendency in that era. So Giuliani, he really changed his political profile in response to the urgency of that moment. Richard Riordan, similarly, is someone who was representing a Los Angeles that had a very different electorate in those years. Now, I talked a bit about how when you're looking at the electorate, it was very different. You had much more of a kind of lower middle class, working class component, but also that was a middle class and working class that was more of a private sector constituency. When you're looking at the middle class in a place like Los Angeles or New York City now, strictly through the lens of income, this is a group that is much more public sector oriented than it had been in that era. And that makes a pretty material difference in terms of their worldview and much else. So I'd say that was a part of it. So between those two things, the fact that there was some wiggle room, there was much more split ticket voting. Honestly, even if you compare now, 2020, to 2004, there's just far less split ticket voting now than there was then. There are many hypotheses as to why that's true, but certainly when you're looking at mayoral elections in the 1990s, it was just a totally, totally different landscape in which those parties were less ideologically consolidated than they were today. Now, it's also worth keeping in mind that some of those reformist mayors in the 1990s were Democrats who were also responding to that different environment. And if you're looking at this moment right now, I really would argue that part of it is that you have a huge portion of the working class in these cities that is simply not participating in electoral politics at all. Now, we can make all kinds of conjectures as to how they would vote if they participated. You could project onto them, based on this or that characteristic, how they might vote. But the fundamental fact is that you have huge numbers of people who are the essential workers, who are the people who are the ones who are affected in a very direct way by the quality of public services, by public safety, who are just simply not taking part in the civic and political life of these cities. And I think that's a very big deal, and something that those of us who want to offer an alternative to the kind of current governing model in these cities need to really keep in mind as an opportunity, as a challenge, but also as a real opportunity. But I'd say that is a very, very big change.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You mentioned it earlier. I think earlier you said a couple of the reasons for that. One, many of those essential workers or the working class are unauthorized immigrants. And another is that many are legal permanent residents who just don't want to naturalize. Are there other reasons for this kind of secession of the working class from the politics of our cities?
There are a few different things going on. So one thing I'll just note is that when it comes to that population of lawful permanent residents who don't naturalize, part of it is choice, and part of it is just very deep disconnection from the political life of the city and of the country. And also part of it is that much of this population is very, very poor. Now, we can debate whether or not it is reasonable or legitimate to charge reasonable fees that, make those programs self-sustaining. That is naturalization and much else, things that, require some measure of administration. But, one thing that people don't fully appreciate is that there are many lawful permanent residents who have been so poor for so long that actually even quite modest fees for naturalization are actually a meaningful barrier for them. So in New York City in particular, there are over 600,000 people who fall into that category. When it comes to the unauthorized population, estimates vary as to the size of it. But then you also have this naturalized population, immigrants who have become citizens, who just typically participate at lower rates than native-born citizens for a variety of reasons. And then you also have the fact that a lot of working class folks are just less likely to take part in elections, particularly when they're off-cycle elections, which is common when you're looking at elections at the municipal level in the United States. So that's something that affects the playing field as well. And my general sense is that a lot of people on the right think that having narrower participation can be a good thing, because you want people who are more conscientious, who are making a deliberate choice to be active participants. And that could be true, but I do wonder if there's another story one could tell, which is that there is a large number of people who are not active participants who might actually be sensitive and might be responsive to the argument that the failures of the public sector are a product of monopoly governance, are a product of the fact that you don't have meaningful competition at those levels of government, and that there might be another approach that might be more resonant with them. I mean, one can be delusional about that, and I think it would be foolish to overpromise, but I do think that there's a lot we simply do not know about this large class of people who are non-participants in the political life of our cities.
Just one asterisk on that before we go to the students. I recall you last year in talking to the Hertog students discussing a moment in which portion of this population was activated, and that was the discussion surrounding the basically the reduction of standards of entry to the Stuyvesant and Bronx Science, the kind of the high achieving public schools in New York City. Could you care to address that, and how I think the reaction among, primarily I believe it was the Chinese immigrant population in New York, kind of shaped the politics of that decision?
This is a really fascinating and tricky set of issues that relates to how we think about diasporas, how we think about ethnic categories in our country in general. But when you're looking at the changing demographics of New York City, one element, as I mentioned, is that you've seen a large increase in the proportion of the population that has its origins in Asia. So that has gone from 7% in 1990 to 14% now. And if you're looking at that population as a whole, it's of course a very diverse population, but you do have a kernel of that population, folks who have school-age children, people who are not necessarily deeply involved in partisan politics. But when you're looking at those who are citizens, many of them naturalized citizens, these are people who are becoming somewhat more active around issues that relate to what they perceive to be their group interest. So part of this is the debate around racial preferences, quotas that aim to limit the representation of people particularly of Chinese descent in elite schools. And I think it's very, very interesting because it is a bit complicated. For example, a lot of this organizing has been happening on WeChat. A lot of this organizing has been happening among people of relatively recent vintage, many of whom are actually quite sympathetic to the People's Republic of China, for example.
Right.
Yet when it comes to the cultural politics of the United States, take what we would see as a kind of right of center perspective. That's pretty different from the Chinese American population you had in New York City when I was growing up, which was, much more heavily Fujianese, Cantonese, and had a much more oppositional sensibility in some ways. Then you also have this kind of Chinese American establishment that is really embedded in the political life of the city, which is very much in favor of racial preferences, very much in favor of limits on the specialized high schools and what have you. But again, that's not a group that's necessarily representative of the population at large. So that's something that I think is going to be very interesting, where we could see a lot of change. And I think that, really, whenever you dig into any one of these immigrant origin populations, you see a lot more complexity than you get from looking at these populations in big pan-ethnic terms. When you use abstractions like people of color, when you talk about Black and brown communities, you lose a lot of the distinctiveness, a lot of the flavor, a lot of the nuance that is going to become a more pronounced reality of urban politics as you start seeing more second generation people, more people who are the children of these immigrants who are going to be more actively involved in the political life of these places. I think you've already seen some sign of that, but I think you're going to see much more of it. And I think it's going to surprise a lot of people. It is not going to be just this very kind of simple, all people of color believe X, therefore our politics will look like Y starting next week.
Well, great. So let's move now to the questions from the political studies fellows, so I don't monopolize this conversation like the municipal governments do city politics. Our first question is from Guy Denton from the University of Birmingham.
Hello, Mr. Salam, Mr. Continetti. This is a true pleasure. Firstly, at the risk of sounding unctuous, may I say, but I greatly admire all of the work that you both do, and so this is a real privilege for me. My question concerns the impact of the coronavirus on cities, which is obviously, although there are many issues facing them, those cannot be addressed until this is dealt with in some fashion. Do you believe that President Trump is correct that the pandemic can best be addressed on the basis of federalism, by devolving authority to state and local leaders? Or should the federal government take a more centralized approach to fighting the pandemic, but one wherein cities can still play a significant role, being that they are hubs of innovation and creativity?
I believe that the best way to think about federalism is not a matter of do you want more or less decentralization, but about thinking about which domains we're talking about and trying to impose greater coherence on how we think about the division of labor between the federal, state, and local governments. And one big challenge we face now is that the division of labor is not especially coherent, and oftentimes for fairly understandable political reasons. So if you're going back to mid-century America, you saw this move in the direction of grant-in-aid federalism or conditional federalism, which many of you will be familiar with, many of you will understand. But the basic idea is that you will provide federal revenue, but you will have programs that will be administered at the state level. And of course, states can then further delegate those powers. However, in order to make this grant-in-aid federalism work, the United States took a somewhat distinctive position, one that was quite different from other federal market democracies. The United States took an approach that was chiefly driven by matching funds. That is, the idea was that the federal government will provide some amount of money that will then be matched by state governments. Now, the difficulty there is that when you're looking at a country like ours, you have very dramatic differences in fiscal capacity from one region to another. And because of those differences, and what I mean by fiscal capacity is, let's say Mississippi and Massachusetts both are taxing their populations at a flat rate of 10%. You are going to get much, much more revenue in a more affluent state than a much poorer state, even if you're exerting the same tax effort. Let's put it that way. And so then you could say, well, sure, but it's cheaper to deliver services in a lower cost place. Well, yes and no, because the labor market for some services, particularly for skilled services, is actually more competitive than that would imply. So it's true that there's some things where there are big cost differences. But again, all of this is to say that our model of federalism is one that oftentimes empowers certain places. New York State is a classic example. Connecticut is another great example. Places with a lot of fiscal capacity to aggressively maximize the dollars they get from the federal government. So it's something that actually causes a lot of problems when it comes to simple competence, when it comes to being able to develop services, deliver services in a more or less effective way. So if you think about New York City, for example, or a place like Los Angeles, these are places where you have a lot of skilled professionals and you have a lot of two-earner couples. So this will sound very silly, but it's something that all of you guys as young people will go through in your own lives. When you have a place where you have a lot of these, kind of skilled, educated two-earner couples who are concentrated in a particular place because of its amenities and also because of the labor market opportunities that are there. What it means is that you have an implicit subsidy for the public sector. And the implicit subsidy for the public sector is that you have some talented people who are willing to accept less than, kind of the maximum amount that they could possibly earn to be in leadership roles. And that contributes in some domains to the quality of service in those places. So all of this is to say that when you're dealing with something like COVID, when you're dealing with a pandemic, you absolutely want some things that are tailored to the local level. You want some decisions that are made in ways that they're going to have legitimacy at that level, because different communities have different needs. You have different levels of crowding. You have different conditions that give rise to different vulnerabilities. But it's also true that you also have different capacities. And so what you'd ideally want is a situation in which the federal government is specializing in those areas where only the federal government can be competent and effective. And I would argue that there are some areas where that lack of coherence, which is really not unique to this administration, but really stretches back decades, has really served the United States pretty poorly. So, having a very decentralized society, having a rich tradition of civil society is a tremendous asset. It's one reason why the United States is going to make a disproportionately large contribution to finding lasting cures, to identifying vaccines and much else. It's the fact that we have this decentralized, vibrant, innovative society. But when it comes to actually dealing with a crisis, when you're dealing with some jurisdictions that don't have that kind of human capital in their public sector, I think that it could mean you're going to struggle. So the short answer is that you definitely want to be decentralized in some ways, but you want to be centralized in others. And figuring out exactly what that's going to look like is something that will take time, and it's time that we didn't have.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Avi Kumar of St. John's College.
Thank you, Mr. Salam, for taking the time to chat with us. My question is about brain drain. Brain drain is in public service is a well-known phenomenon, and I can only assume that it's worse in cities than, say, at the federal level. If public sector unions are abolished and wages and benefits are lowered, would that exacerbate the brain drain? And what is the way forward generally for talent development and retention in city government?
Well, one important thing to keep in mind is that moving away from a rigid approach to collective bargaining, moving away from very rigid terms of public employment, does not necessarily mean lowering compensation. In fact, it could mean raising compensation for some roles, lowering it for others, but basically responding to the labor market in a kind of dynamic way that is sensitive to the fact that different cities face different challenges. So in a way, the issue with public sector unions isn't so much that they're raising costs, raising compensation per se on an individual basis. The whole issue is whether or not the compensation dollars are yielding the greatest productivity, whether or not they're yielding the kind of highest quality. And so, I would argue that if you actually moved away from rigid rules, rigid terms of public employment, and first of all, that's not just about unions. It's not just about collective bargaining. It's also about civil service rules. It's also about a panoply of other rules that make it really, really hard to restructure organizations. A good example of this that some of you will be familiar with is what you saw happen in Camden, New Jersey, not long ago. So Camden, New Jersey was a city that had a very serious violent crime problem. It was also a city facing a fiscal crisis. Now, what the city did is dissolve its municipal police department, and they replaced it with a new county police department. Now, the county police department actually literally hired almost all of the personnel who had previously been in the city department, but they drastically reorganized how everyone did business. They voided all of the contracts that were negotiated by that union. Now, notably, the new county police department then decided to establish a new union, but they established it from a very different baseline. And actually, the terms of employment that could be negotiated by that union were somewhat narrowed. So in a way, what you're dealing with in many cities is the fact that you've built up these accretions of rules and established practices that make it really hard to be nimble. A good example of this is in education. Now, one could argue that when you're looking at education, you have this very crude model right now in which you have work rules that say that teachers can't be monitored. You can't have people observing how teachers are doing their job. Now, that also means that they can't get real-time feedback, right? It also means that you can't differentiate compensation for teachers based on their effectiveness or based on which course they're teaching. Like let's say you have a severe shortage of teachers who can teach calculus, but you don't have a shortage of social studies teachers. One thing you might want to do is offer different compensation. You cannot do that in most jurisdictions right now. So the idea here is not just about just in some blanket and crude way lowering compensation, it's about trying to use the compensation budget more effectively. And I would argue that there would be ways. Another good example of this is when you survey many teachers and tell them, would you trade higher wage compensation for a lower level of deferred compensation, pension benefits? Actually, large numbers of teachers would happily accept that bargain, partly because there are teachers who might see themselves as teachers who will teach for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, rather than for a 20, 30-year period. The arrangements we have now really skew things towards those teachers who are going to be in the system for 20 plus years, right? And if you're looking at the union itself, the union is a political body that is going to be oriented toward the median voter. You have such low levels of participation in union elections, and then those votes are oftentimes dominated by retirees and also by those people who are the most risk averse. So it's not necessarily representative of the opinions of the actual workforce. So when you're talking about this conversation about public employees, it's really important to not buy into the framing of people in organized labor who say that this is about lowering compensation across the board. I would argue that it's really about thinking creatively about how can you make the public sector as effective as possible. And what you'd want to do in that case is to not be locked in a way that does not allow you to respond to change. Now, I know I've gone on for some time, but just one good example of this is the movement to remote learning. This is something that has required a lot of creativity, a lot of flexibility on the part of schools. Have you actually seen that creativity or flexibility? Have you seen large urban school districts embrace effective remote learning strategies? No, what you've seen is organized labor try to protect the interests of their members, which is their job, but you've done it, you've seen it in ways that are not going to lead to effectiveness in the classroom, I would argue. And I think that this is going to lead to a lot of rethinking on the part of a lot of people observing how badly our schools have adapted to the situation. And I think that that's going to create an opportunity for people who want to offer an alternative.
Thank you for that question. And we have seen a lot of creativity on the part of the Hertog administration in getting that online virtual learning together. So the public school systems can take some lessons from Hertog. Another question, the next up is Alexandra Kilgore of the Catholic University of America. Alexandra.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today, Mr. Salam. My question is this. Education budgets comprise a large part of city and state costs. However, research shows that increased funds for education don't always yield better educational outcomes, such as higher graduation rates. In your op-ed, you shared the striking example of a policy in the state of Idaho, which gives the parents of every 7th grade student $4,125 to spend on their child's education. Why do you think parceling out funds directly at parents improves students' educational outcomes? And how can the success of Idaho's policy be replicated in cities?
First, I think that some humility is in order here because the Idaho program is relatively new, and so we'll see how it unfolds. But I do believe that there's an element of principle at work here too, which is that we have a pluralistic society. And one argument that my colleague Ray Dominico often makes is that schools are most effective when they're aligned with the values and sensibilities of families. There's a lot of talk about the fact that young people are in school for only, say, 8 hours a day, and of course, far less than that right now. But they're, in their families, they're in their communities for a much longer period of time. And when you have schools that are reinforcing the values and sensibilities of families, you can have a kind of much more effective kind of education. And also this pluralism demands that, we do care about certain educational outcomes, test scores and what have you, but there might be other things we care about too. And in a way, I would argue that much of our current cultural discontent stems from a kind of monistic approach to American life. The idea that there is one way to think, the idea that there is one kind of good life, that we want everyone to become a college-educated professional, and it implicitly devalues many other ways of life in a way that I think engenders a lot of resentment, and also in a way that actually inhibits the potential of our society, because I think that pluralism is actually a great asset. When you're thinking about the fact that about half of younger people are not going to complete a four-year college education, they're not college-bound, period. Actually, it's a larger number who will not complete a four-year degree altogether. But regardless, you have this huge number of people where when you have this very narrow conception of what a good life is going to look like, you're pretty much writing those folks off. So I think that when you're looking at a kind of rigid and centralized system, I think in some ways it's an offense to the fact that there are many different ways to achieve a kind of good and productive life. And I think that you want to allow for experimentation. You want to see a variety of different instructional models. Then there are more prosaic dimensions to this. So we've learned that certain kinds of remote instruction can be really effective. For example, when you pair mentor teachers with apprentice teachers so that you can have more differentiated compensation. We pay this mentor teacher much more than partner teachers and apprentice teachers, but also you're able to scale up the ability of that mentor teacher to influence a much larger number of students. There are just so many different models. Or you could say, we can't offer Mandarin with a live in-person teacher in this community, but we can offer that on a remote basis. So when you disaggregate the school, when you say that, let's say half of your budget is going to go to this particular school, this particular building, but then another half is going to go to pursue a variety of different services, you create a much thicker marketplace that allows for new instructional providers to emerge, including providers who are not bound by geography in the same way. So I think that it just is something that would really unlock the creativity of many more people, so that if you're in a small rural community, if you're in an inner city community, you can access talent that exists in other parts of the country, or even talent that exists in Israel, Singapore, or somewhere else entirely. So I think on every dimension, a more decentralized, pluralistic approach is going to allow us to really learn what are the best, most effective models. And also, it's not just a matter of the best or the most effective. It's about what suits different students and different families.
Great. So for our next question, we're going to Dominic Pino of George Mason University.
Hello, Mr. Salam, thank you so much for speaking with us. Earlier we were talking about the nationalization of elections, and that seems to present, to me, a dilemma for conservatives. On the one hand, they're bad for our constitutional order because it blurs the lines of federalism and makes it harder to have a local accountability in government. But on the other hand, conservatives seem to do better in nationalized elections than otherwise, whether it's Newt Gingrich's contract with America, Republicans generally having a better shot at winning the White House than at winning Congress historically. Or nowadays, it seems like the default for Republican strategists is to run a House race against Nancy Pelosi instead of against your opponent. And so should conservatives want less nationalized elections? And if so, what can we do to make that happen?
So you're smuggling in an assumption about what is the more effective strategy for Republicans. And the truth is that, I think that's debatable. There's so many different factors at work. There is a fascinating book by Matt Grossman, a political scientist in Michigan State, called Red State Blues, which you might have seen, in which he's arguing that, for the past 25 years, you've seen, leading up to 2018, you saw extraordinary success among Republicans at the level of the state house. But now you're seeing, as you were suggesting, this intense nationalization where the state legislature is held by Republicans in every state that voted for Donald Trump in 2016, with, I believe, one exception, and the same for the Clinton states and Democrats. It is really quite extraordinary. But we don't know what the outcome of the 2020 election is going to look like. And also you're seeing a movement in college-educated voters that's quite pronounced between 2016 and 2020, one that could change that calculus. Another thing that Grossman observed is that though you had Republican victories at the state level that were quite impressive, quite sweeping, you did not see meaningful restraint in the growth of public expenditures at that level. That's partly because of conditional federalism and much else. But part of it is what you care about the party label, or is what you care about some discrete policy objectives? And again, that's debatable. We could talk about that. But when it comes to those objectives, in a way, if you care, for example, about having high quality public services at low cost, if you believe, as I do, that if you're going to have redistribution, it certainly should not happen at the state and local level. If it's going to happen, it should happen at the federal level, because state and local governments, are not going to be especially effective at that, partly because populations are more footloose at that level. And also just, I think it can lead itself to incoherence pretty quickly. If you believe that, you want people who believe that not just to have this or that social identity, not just to vote this way in national elections. You want a broader coalition of people who share that sensibility. So I think that it's partly a matter of conservatives putting all of their eggs in one basket and being able to connect with people who don't necessarily think of themselves as conservative when it comes to conflicts around social identity. So I think that that's a big reason to be mindful of it. I also think that it's really just about the idea that when you don't have competitive elections, you really don't have the kind of surveillance that you want of public officials. This also relates to the deterioration of local journalism. When you know that all that matters is the outcome of a primary election, and when those primary electorates are even narrower than the already narrow electorates that you have in general elections, I think that can be pretty darn dangerous. You see that in particular in cities where increasingly you see primary electorates that are dominated by people who directly profit from government, through being, for example, members of public sector unions. And I think that can really badly distort what's happening at the state and local level. So I think that it can be useful not just to think about partisanship, but also about what are the policy outcomes that we want to have, and are they helped or harmed by having competitive elections? Now, if you believe that the prerogatives of public sector unions are a good and positive thing, that we want to have less scrutiny, that we do not want those, we don't want greater transparency in that domain, then actually this is a pretty decent outcome. And kind of going further in this direction could actually be a pretty good thing. I disagree with that proposition, which is why I want more transparency and more competition. There's much more to say about this, which I'd be happy to talk to you about further. But I think that the nationalization of elections has had a number of baleful consequences, particularly for those who care about conservative policy objectives.
All right, our final question from students will come from Jake Haas of St. Mary's College of California. Jake.
Hi, Mr. Salam. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I was wondering, as Americans have increasingly sorted themselves among ideological and cultural and geographic lines, conservatism has obviously taken a more rural posture. I was wondering what you thought would be the prospects for a more city-minded, urban conservative movement, and what the features of that would look like.
Well, one answer is that I think it's inevitable. And the reason I think a more urban-focused conservative or center-right politics is inevitable is because about 80% of the country lives in urbanized areas. Now, that feels like a bit of a dodge because, of course, that has a very expansive definition. But even if you're looking at kind of large, populous, diverse metro areas, these represent, depending on your definition, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population as a whole, and a larger share of GDP. But also, these are places that set the cultural and intellectual direction of the country, I would argue. And in some ways, they're prefiguring larger changes in the country as a whole. So, one way to think about the kind of larger political landscape is that the period since the Great Recession has been a period when the country has been very focused, and political strategists have been very focused on a slice of the electorate, call them the Perot voter, call them the Obama-Trump voters. These are people who are particularly concentrated in the Rust Belt, the upper Midwest. But it's a part of what Michael Lind would call the heartland working class. But then now, if you're looking at the COVID crisis, you're seeing another population that's being activated. And this is what he would call the hub working class. That is the working class that you see in those large, dense metro areas. Now, one reason why that population has not been particularly politically relevant over the last decade is for all the reasons that Matt and I were discussing earlier. Just this population is not politically engaged. If they're foreign-born, they may well be unauthorized. They may well not be naturalized, or they might be naturalized and they just don't vote. If they're native-born, they might just not be active participants in our public life. To the extent they do participate, it seems like they're not all hard left. Right? I mean, if you look at the Democratic primaries, such as they were, there were somewhat surprising outcomes. But this kind of hub working class, this is a group of people who are going to be very challenged by the COVID crisis. They're very concentrated in in-person services. Some number of them are in public sector employment. And this is a group that I think is going to be pretty angry. And it's going to be a group that has disproportionate influence on the shape of our future because they're somewhat younger and therefore they're more likely to be parents. If you're looking at the median age of different groups in the population, the non-Hispanic white population has a median age in the 40s. If you look at the Hispanic population, the median age is in the 30s. Over the next 30 years or so, you're going to see a massive transfer of $30 to $40 trillion of wealth from baby boomers to their children. That transfer is going to be very uneven, right? So if you're looking at that kind of diverse, non-college educated population, it has not been politically relevant. It's about to become so politically relevant that it's going to really shake the country and change the country in a lot of meaningful ways. Now, if you are building a center-right coalition that does not speak to that constituency, then you are going to be marginal. Now, it is possible that you are going to be able to win the Electoral College. It is possible that you will be able to maintain some advantage in the US Senate for some period of time. But even then, you're seeing states, including those states that are, predominantly rural states, you're seeing them diversify pretty quickly as well. And I actually think that if you're looking at underlying trends, actually right of center politicians are faring better than is commonly believed. With people of Latin American origin, particularly second and third generation. It depends to some degree on geography, with younger secular African Americans. So there are some interesting countervailing trends that are not kind of often discussed, but there is some opportunity there. And the cities are the laboratory for this. The cities both substantively, because that's a place where you have a big population and therefore big challenges and a big effect on political outcomes, but also because the things that you see in the cities are phenomena that you come to see in the suburbs with a delay of a few years. And I think we've already seen that in our politics over the last couple of years, and I think we're going to see more of it in the years to come. So you simply have to see it. As to the contours of that, there's a lot to say about that. But I think a big part of it is that I think that offering pluralism, including pluralism when it comes to how we approach public education, when it comes to the delivery of public services, I think that is going to be a very compelling message. And I think it's actually going to be much more compelling than a very rigid, racialized perspective on the world. So I think that that's going to be something that is going to be very potent. And I also think that the politics of taxes and spending are going to change in surprising ways. That's something we could talk about at greater length. But I think that the curbing of the state and local tax deduction has created some very interesting opportunities, which is one reason why some very savvy political actors, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, are desperate to change that, are desperate to bring back the state and local tax deduction as it existed before. I think that it's important to pay attention to what these people argue, what they think, what they see as priorities, because it speaks to what the kind of medium-term vulnerabilities might be for folks on their side of the aisle. But again, this is not a partisan conversation. It really is about how do you create opportunities for folks who want to advance a more decentralized, who kind of want to advance an approach that really emphasizes civil society and entrepreneurship more than centralized direction.
All right, well, thank you, Jake. I have time to ask one more question as the moderator for Reihan before we close. And I guess I'd frame it this way. Reihan, you were probably the most well-read person I've ever encountered. So I want to ask you, since January, what's the best piece of writing you've encountered that you would recommend to all the people paying attention to this call?
Well, I'm sorry to say that I now have 2 children under the age of 19 months, and also am hard at work at the Manhattan Institute, so I'm not able to do quite as much reading for leisure as I'd like. But I will give you something, gosh. One book that I found really interesting is a book called Steadfast Democrats that has some bearing on the kind of political conversation we've been having. And it's a book about the political sensibilities of African Americans and why you see such monolithic support for the Democratic Party. And it's a really interesting book, and it actually offers a lot of insight into a number of different social phenomena beyond the kind of precipitating question behind the book. And then there's another book, a novel that my wife and I read recently called Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. This is a book that has been very well received by a lot of people, so it's certainly not original to me, but it's a really fun book. It's an easy read. It's something that one could read in 1 or 2 sittings. So if you're looking for leisure, if you're looking for escapism, you might enjoy it. It has some foul language, so if you're offended by that kind of thing, be aware. But it is a fun read.
Great. You did not disappoint. That is all the time we have today. So I want to thank you, Reihan Salam, for joining us, and I want to thank all the students for your excellent questions. And until next time.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And if you'd like to follow up, please feel free to get in touch.